Welcome back to the Cyber Pulse, your weekly update on people, processes, and tools shaping the cybersecurity industry for builders, practitioners, and leaders in the space. In this episode, I'm covering how governance is starting to catch up with reality, tool sprawl and exposure management, workforce pressure, and the market forces shaping how security gets built and sold in 2026. Let's get into it. Let's start with a governance signal that caught my attention out of the Asia Pacific region. I found this one in the International Association of Privacy Professionals, looking at recent amendments to China's cybersecurity law that explicitly introduce AI governance provisions. One of the more interesting governance signals coming in 2026 is how explicitly AI is being written into cybersecurity law in parts of Asia Pacific region. These amendments to China's cybersecurity law don't treat AI as a future concern. They name it directly, calling out AI ethics, AI risk assessment, and AI governance as things the government intends to strengthen, while at the same time saying innovation and training data development should continue. What matters here is the structure. AI is being framed as something that already creates security and risk management obligations, not something organizations can defer until later. For practitioners, this reinforces a trend we're already seeing. AI risk is being pushed down to security teams before governance models are fully settled. Whether it's model access, training data exposure, or agent permissions, teams are being asked to manage risk in systems that work differently than traditional controls. The takeaway is that AI security is moving from best practice to expectation. Next, I want to talk about something practitioners have been feeling for a long time: tool sprawl. This comes from an article in IT Pro that looks at how security tool sprawl turns into real governance and decision-making problems. This article does a good job of reframing the complaint practitioners have had for years. The problem isn't just that organizations have too many security tools. It's that tool sprawl creates governance and decision-making problems that slow teams down. When multiple tools disagree on asset inventories, severity, or ownership, humans become the integration layer. That means more meetings, more handoffs, and more time spent reconciling what's actually true before anybody can act. The piece highlights how fragmented ownership, security owning some tools, IT owning others, cloud teams owning another slice, turns technical sprawl into organizational friction. The real mitigation strategy is aligning tools to processes, ownership, and decisions. If a tool doesn't shorten time to confidence, it's probably adding a hidden cost. Next up, I want to look at how governments are thinking about cyber risk right now. This article comes from TechRadar Pro and covers the UK's new Cyber Action Plan and what it signals about ongoing risk. The UK's new Cyber Action Plan is notable less for the funding amount and more for the language around it. Yes, £210 million is a real investment, but the government is also openly acknowledging that cyber risk remains critically high, and that's an important admission. It suggests that spending alone hasn't closed the gap between threats and resilience. The plan emphasizes workforce development, resilience, and coordination, which signals a shift away from assuming technology alone will solve systemic issues. For practitioners, this reinforces a familiar reality. National strategies increasingly depend on operational execution by security teams who are already stretched thin. The interesting question for 2026 is whether funding and policy translate into simpler requirements and clearer priorities, or whether they add another layer of compliance work without reducing risk. Teams will feel the difference quickly. Now, let's zoom out to the market for a bit. This piece from Investors Business Daily looks at why cybersecurity acquisitions are expected to continue in 2026, especially as AI reshapes platform strategies. This Investors.com piece reflects a market assumption that cybersecurity consolidation isn't slowing, it's accelerating. The driver here is AI. Larger platforms want AI capabilities integrated into detection, response, identity, and cloud security, and it's often faster to buy than to build. From a practitioner standpoint, this has mixed implications. On one hand, consolidation can reduce vendor count. On the other hand, it often increases platform complexity before integration catches up. For go-to-market and founders, this signals where buyers believe the long-term value is: platforms that can combine data, context, and workflow across domains. Staying with the market theme for a moment, there's a specific acquisition worth unpacking. This one also comes from Investors Business Daily and focuses on CrowdStrike's move to acquire an identity security firm as part of the broader platform race. CrowdStrike's move to acquire an identity security firm signals that endpoint-centric security isn't enough on its own. Identity data is increasingly necessary to understand attacks, privilege misuse, and lateral movement. For practitioners, this reflects reality. Identity incidents are slow, noisy, and expensive to resolve, especially when identity tooling lives outside SOC workflows. The platform race isn't really about future threat. It's about whether identity signals can be operationalized fast enough to matter during an incident, not just after an audit. I expect identity to keep pulling budget, attention, and integration effort in 2026. Next, I want to talk about the people side of cybersecurity. This comes from the 2025 ISC Squared Cybersecurity Workforce Study, which gives a more nuanced view of what's happening with hiring, burnout, and retention. The ISC Squared Workforce Study is useful because it adds nuance to the millions of unfilled jobs narrative. Yes, the workforce gap persists, but the study shows growing pressure around skills mismatch, burnout, and retention, not just headcount shortages. Many organizations report difficulty hiring experienced practitioners while simultaneously struggling to support and retain existing teams. This is a structural problem, not a pipeline problem. The study also points to increasing expectations of security roles. Broader scope, more tools, more accountability, often not clearer authority. For practitioners, this explains why burnout conversations keep resurfacing. It's about control, clarity, and sustainability. For leaders, the takeaway is that the workforce strategy in 2026 has to include workload design and operational realism. And finally, let's talk about how vulnerability management itself is changing. This article from Brilliant Security Magazine looks at why exposure management is gaining traction as teams move beyond raw vulnerability counts. This article captures a quiet but important shift in how security teams think about vulnerability management. The core argument is that counting vulnerabilities doesn't reduce risk. Understanding exposure does. Exposure management focuses on context, which assets matter, which vulnerabilities are reachable, and which paths attackers could realistically exploit. That's closer to how practitioners are already thinking during incidents. The reason this is resonating now is scale. Cloud, identity sprawl, and continuous change make periodic scanning less useful on its own. For security teams, exposure management is about changing how prioritization works, so effort maps to real risk instead of raw severity scores. If vulnerability management was about coverage, exposure management is about relevance. That wraps this week's Cyber Pulse. There's a theme across these stories. It's that cybersecurity is changing operationally, organizationally, and economically. And those shifts matter as much as the tools themselves. I'll see you next week. For now, it's time to get back to business. Keep hacking your success.